Before he could conquer the world, he first had to conquer himself and decisively remove anyone standing in his way. He was a 20-year-old boy who in a few short, terrifying months made a clean sweep of mothers, brothers, uncles and cousins, eliminating every threat with surgical precision. He is not yet Alexander the Great. He is just a prince casting a shadow the size of an empire, a shadow born from fear and forged in blood. Hello everyone and welcome back to Immortal History. Today we're not recounting Alexander's legendary victories against the Persians at Granicus or Gaugamela. We won't speak of the Gordian knot or the founding of cities that would bear his name for millennia. Instead, we'll explore the brutal, visceral and lesser-known story of how he truly became king. Because in the neat pages of the history books, the transition is deceptively simple, a single sentence. Philip dies, Alexander ascends to the throne. But the reality was a gruesome spectacle of ambition, survival, and political assassination that unleashed a river of blood, staining his legacy for his entire life. Our story begins in Pella, in the year 356 BC. Here a child was raised in a crucible of conflict. He was caught between the ambiguous, almost obsessive love of a mother who believed herself a descendant of Achilles, and the relentlessly critical eye of a father who was single-handedly rewriting the history of Greece. This boy would grow up with three masters, each shaping him in their own profound way. Aristotle, the philosopher who taught him to think, Homer, the poet who taught him what it meant to be a hero, and the ever-present, gnawing fear of losing everything before he even had a chance to claim it. To the cultured, sophisticated city-states like Athens and Thebes, Macedonia was a rugged, mountainous backwater. It was seen as a province of hearty timber and uncivilized, hard-drinking warriors, not a true Hellenic power worthy of respect. But Philip II, a man forged in the fires of adversity as a former political hostage in Thebes, possessed a vision that stretched far beyond his kingdom's borders. He had studied the art of war from its greatest masters and returned not just as a student, but as a revolutionary innovator. With relentless determination, he completely redesigned the Macedonian army, transforming it from a disorganized seasonal militia into a disciplined professional fighting force that would dominate the age. He introduced the formidable phalanx, armed with the sarissa, a terrifying spear over 3.5 meters long that created an impenetrable, bristling wall of death. Under Philip's command, Macedonia, the backwater province, became a relentless war machine. When his wife Olympias gives birth to a son, Alexander, prophecies and omens swirl around the court, claiming the boy is destined for unparalleled victory. But Philip, ever the pragmatist, knew that prophecies didn't win battles or secure dynasties. He needed more than just a son. He needed a powerful, unquestionable heir. And so, two colossal competing figures loomed over every moment of Alexander's childhood. On one side there was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, proud, mystical and deeply unshakably convinced of her divine descent from the mythical hero Achilles. She was a devotee of esoteric Dionysian cults, a woman who, according to unsettling accounts from the court, slept with snakes as part of her religious rites, embracing a world of shadow and spirit that was alien to the pragmatic Macedonians. On the other side stood Philip, a brilliant, ruthless strategist, a man who collected wives like political assets, marrying for alliances and cementing his power with each new union. Alexander grew up breathing this toxic air of ambition and deep-seated mistrust. The simmering tension became a palpable public threat when, at the age of 7, he watched his father bring yet another wife to court, the young Cleopatra Eurydice. She was a noblewoman of pure Macedonian blood and, more dangerously, the niece of the influential general Attalus. With her arrival came a new and terrifying threat, a whisper that soon became a roar in the halls of power. The potential for a more legitimate heir, one who would be of pure Macedonian blood on both sides. This was unlike Alexander, whose Epirote mother was viewed by some as an outsider. In the viper's nest of the Macedonian court, the young prince learned a brutal early lesson. Power is never secure. It is a flickering flame that can be extinguished at any moment, even during a celebratory banquet. When Alexander turned 13, Philip, recognizing the need to shape his son's formidable intellect, provided him with a tutor, whose name would echo through history: Aristotle. The king lured the great philosopher to Macedonia with lavish promises, including the complete state-funded rebuilding of Aristotle's raised hometown of Stagira. At a secluded, beautiful sanctuary known as the Temple of the Nymphs at Mieza, Aristotle established a school for the prince and the sons of Macedonian nobles. Here, in the shade of ancient trees, he taught Alexander and his companions, boys who would one day become his most loyal generals, a vast curriculum: medicine, zoology, logic, art, and the intricate arts of rhetoric and governance. But more than mere subjects, Aristotle instilled in him a philosophy of arete, of excellence, and a deep, burning passion for the epic works of Homer. Alexander began carrying a specially annotated copy of the Iliad with him everywhere he went, even underlining his favorite passages with the tip of his knife. He didn't just want to read about heroes like Achilles. He was determined to become the new Achilles, a living embodiment of the heroic ideal. 2 years later, at the age of 15, another teacher entered his life, this one with 4 legs and a spirit of fire. A Thessalian horse dealer presented Philip with a magnificent black stallion, tall and powerful, but so wild and seemingly insane that no rider could tame it. His name was Bucephalus. As handler after handler was thrown violently to the ground, Philip, growing annoyed at the spectacle of failure, ordered the beast to be taken away. But Alexander, who had been watching intently, spoke up. He boldly claimed the men failed not from a lack of strength, but from a profound lack of understanding. He wagered the full price of the horse, an astronomical sum of 13 talents, that he could ride it. The court watched, amused and skeptical. The boy approached the stallion, not with force or a whip, but with quiet observation. He noticed the horse was not mad, but terrified of its own large, dancing shadow on the ground. Speaking to it softly, in a calm and reassuring voice, Alexander gently turned Bucephalus towards the sun, making its frightening shadow disappear behind it. He stroked its neck, calmed its fears, and then, in one fluid motion, swung onto its back and galloped before the astonished court. It was more than just taming a horse. It was a deeply symbolic act. Alexander had demonstrated that true power came not from brute force, but from intelligence, empathy, and courage. He had claimed a symbol of untamable power through intuition. From that moment, Bucephalus became an extension of his own burning ambition. Wherever that horse's hooves would tread, Alexander would rule. Philip, outwardly proud of his son's undeniable prowess, appointed him regent of Thrace at just 16. He even left Alexander in charge of Macedonia while he campaigned abroad. But this pride was increasingly mixed with a growing, gnawing unease. He had wanted a capable heir, but he had not bargained for one whose brilliance could so easily eclipse his own. The already frayed, competitive relationship between father and son finally snapped in the most public and humiliating way possible during the wedding banquet for Philip's new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. Her uncle Attalus, a powerful general filled with wine and arrogance, raised his cup high and proposed a toast, shouting for all to hear, "To the new royal couple, now at last, Macedonia will have a truly pure-blooded and lawful king." The insult was a dagger aimed directly at Alexander and his mother. Enraged, Alexander leaped to his feet, hurling his own cup of wine at Attalus and screaming, "Am I then a bastard, you villain?" The hall erupted. Philip, siding with his new family, drew his sword and lunged clumsily at his son. But in his drunken rage, the great king of Macedon, conqueror of Greece, stumbled over the couches and fell pathetically to the floor. Alexander looked down at his father's sprawling form with cold contempt and sneered, "Here is the man who would cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even make it from one couch to another." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Olympias was sent into exile in her homeland of Epirus, and Alexander, feeling the very ground crumble beneath him, sought refuge in Illyria. This public humiliation was a crucible for Alexander. It taught him that his only true protection lay not in his birthright, but in cold, hard power and the unwavering loyalty of the army. A silent duel of wills began. Philip, seeking to reconcile but also to test him, recalled his son. The father sent him on dangerous campaigns in Thrace, perhaps hoping to temper his ambition, or perhaps secretly to be rid of him for good. But the son returned each time not only victorious, but with soldiers who were more devoted to him than ever before. While Philip convened the League of Corinth to plan his great legacy-defining invasion of Persia, he was also constantly looking over his shoulder at the irresistible, ambitious, and dangerously popular heir he had created. The year is 336 BC. The ancient capital of Aegae is alive with celebration. A grand wedding is underway, uniting Alexander's sister, Cleopatra, with the king of Epirus, a brilliant political alliance orchestrated by Philip to further secure his power and isolate his exiled wife, Olympias. Philip, at the absolute height of his glory, the undisputed master of Greece, entered the procession. He strode confidently into the grand theatre, having intentionally ordered his bodyguards to keep their distance, a calculated display of magnanimity to appear approachable and beloved before the assembled Greek dignitaries. It was a fatal miscalculation. From out of the crowd, a man named Pausanias, one of his own royal bodyguards, darted forward. In a flash of steel, he drew a dagger and plunged it deep into the king's ribs. Philip, the great conqueror, fell, dying instantly amidst the shocked gasps of the onlookers. Pausanias turned and fled toward horses that were clearly waiting for his escape, but he was run down and brutally slaughtered by his fellow guards before he could be questioned. Chaos erupted. The celebration turned into a scene of panic, and rumors spread like wildfire. Who had orchestrated the plot? Was it the Persian Empire, desperate to stop Philip's impending invasion before it even began? Was it a conspiracy of resentful Macedonian nobles who chafed under Philip's iron rule? Or was it the exiled Queen Olympias, who, from afar, was said to have publicly thanked the gods upon hearing the news of her husband's death? The most chilling whispers, spoken in hushed tones, implicated Alexander himself, the son who had the most to gain and who had been so recently and publicly humiliated. While the court descended into panic and wild speculation, Alexander remained unnervingly cold, focused and decisive. His orders were simple, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Bury my father with all honors, but prepare my horse." He understood with chilling clarity that the throne of Macedon was a vacuum, and if he did not fill it in a single day, he would be the next to fall. At just 20 years old, Alexander was proclaimed king by the army, his legitimacy secured by the cheers of the soldiers he had led and bled with. His first act was not to plan a foreign campaign or to reform a law, but to cauterize the wounds of succession with fire and steel. The throne was surrounded by a constellation of potential rivals, and he moved with terrifying speed to eliminate every single one. First was his cousin Amyntas IV, who possessed a legitimate and perhaps stronger claim to the throne through the direct male line of succession. He was swiftly arrested on charges of conspiracy and executed. Next was Attalus, the powerful general whose drunken insult at the wedding had started the final fatal rift with Philip. Attalus was in Asia Minor, commanding a 10,000-man expeditionary force, a perfect position from which to challenge the new king and champion the cause of Philip's infant son. An envoy from Alexander reached him with a simple, brutal message. Attalus was killed by his own men, who quickly swore fealty to the new decisive king. The most horrific and personal vengeance was reserved for the family that threatened his legitimacy most directly. Philip's young widow, Cleopatra Eurydice, sought sanctuary in a temple, clutching her infant daughter, but there was no mercy. Historical accounts, though disputed, claim that the vengeful Olympias returned from exile and dragged her out. She then allegedly forced the young queen to hang herself, but only after witnessing the murder of her baby, Europa. In a matter of days, the royal family was ruthlessly and systematically purged. The Macedonian nobles, who had been watching cautiously to see which way the wind would blow, were terrified into submission. They swore their absolute and unwavering allegiance. Alexander had not yet fought a single great battle against a foreign enemy, but he had already won the most dangerous war of all, the one for power at home. The price was steep, a throne built upon the blood and bones of his own family. With Macedonia now firmly in his iron grip, the Greek city-states, long resentful of Philip's dominance, saw their chance. In Athens and Thebes, orators and politicians took to the stage, declaring that the strong man was dead, and with him, Macedonian authority over all of Greece. They confidently believed Alexander was just a boy, an unproven youth who could be easily brushed aside. A false rumor of his death during a northern campaign against barbarian tribes was all it took for the proud city of Thebes to openly revolt, expelling the Macedonian garrison. Alexander moved with a speed that defied belief, a lightning strike of military force. He marched his entire army south so quickly that the Thebans refused to believe the reports. They insisted it was a different, lesser Alexander. In a matter of days, he was at the gates of Thebes. He offered terms, demanding only the surrender of the revolt's ringleaders. But the city, defiant and proud, repelled his envoys. The assault was swift and brutal. When Alexander noticed a side gate left momentarily unguarded, he ordered his commander Perdiccas to storm it. The Macedonian garrison, which had been trapped in the city's citadel, the Cadmea, broke out to join the fight from within. The city was surrounded and conquered in hours. Alexander's retribution was designed to be a terrifying message to all of Greece. 6,000 Thebans were slaughtered in the streets, and 30,000 more, the entire surviving population, were rounded up and sold into slavery. Then, he gave the order for the city to be razed to the ground. Every building, every home, every wall was systematically demolished. The only exceptions were the temples of the gods and the house of the poet Pindar, whose ancestor had once written verses praising an ancestor of Alexander's own. The shockwave of Thebes' utter destruction reverberated across Greece. Athens, which had been cheering on the rebellion from afar, was now paralyzed with terror. They immediately sent envoys to beg for mercy, which Alexander, having made his point, granted. At 20.5 years old, Alexander had not only restored his father's empire, but had forged a new and terrifying reputation, he who utterly destroys that which disobeys him. Now, and only now, with Greece silenced by fear, could he finally look east. The Persian Empire awaited. If you're enjoying this journey into the brutal realities of blood and glory, leave a like. It truly helps the video find those who love history, not just the sanitized textbook version of battles. And if you want the next episode on the Asian campaigns, the invasion of the Persian Empire, subscribe and hit that notification bell. No algorithm will keep us from crossing the Hellespont. Before setting out to conquer Asia in the spring of 334 BC, Alexander made one final deeply symbolic pilgrimage. He sailed to the shores of Troy, the hallowed, windswept ground of the heroes from his childhood. This was the landscape of the Iliad, the place where his supposed ancestor Achilles had fought and died. There he laid a wreath on Achilles' tomb. In a deeply personal, ritualistic act, he and his closest companion, Hephaestion, ran a naked race around the tomb to honor the fallen hero. He then entered the temple of Athena and made a fateful exchange. He dedicated his own armor to the goddess and took in its place a sacrificial axe and a sacred shield, said to have been preserved from the Trojan War itself. These were the weapons he would carry into his first battle in Asia, cloaking himself in the mythic legacy of the past. By his side throughout this pilgrimage stood Bucephalus, his silent, powerful companion, a living symbol of his own destiny. At that moment, no one could have known the incredible, world-altering journey that lay ahead. No one knew that the horse would one day die of old age and battle wounds in the far-off land of India, and that Alexander, in his profound grief, would found the city of Alexandria Bucephalus in his honor, and weep for his horse as he had never wept for any human being. But on that day, standing on the shores of Troy, the boy and the horse were a single spear, aimed at the vast, seemingly infinite horizon of the Persian Empire. Behind him, he left a silent court, a bloodthirsty and triumphant mother, a murdered father whose ambitions he had inherited, and an empire he had built upon the bones of his own family. From the venomous courts of Pella to the dusty plains of India, the myth of Alexander the Great truly begins here. Not with a glorious battle against a foreign king, but with a cold and ruthless choice made in the chaotic aftermath of his father's murder, the throne or the family. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not have both. So when we speak of the great conqueror, the military genius who redrew the map of the known world, let us first remember the boy who silenced his own conscience with the thundering, world-shaking steps of Bucephalus. The blood of his relatives did not stain him or hold him back. It was the fire that tempered him, forging him like a sword in a furnace of betrayal and ambition. From that hardened, unbreakable metal, the conqueror who would change geography, culture, and the very course of history was born. If you want to continue following his trail of conquest, leave a comment. What would you have done at 20 years old, faced with the choice of losing a kingdom or sacrificing your own kin? In the next episode, we will cross the Hellespont with 35,000 soldiers and witness how a boy from the mountains of Macedonia faced the colossal shadow of the greatest empire on earth. But always remember, before he could become a god in the eyes of men, he first had to become a king. And before he could become a king, he first had to become a survivor. If you liked this video, share it with a friend who loves stories of power, ambition, and their inevitable, often bloody consequences. Subscribing, liking, commenting, every action is a small army that helps our channel grow. We'll see you soon on the banks of the Granicus River. A king stands on the edge of a continent, his gaze fixed not on the horizon, but on the ghost of his father. He has secured a kingdom with the blood of his family. Now, he will conquer an empire to prove he was worthy of the throne he stole. He is 22 years old, and he has just crossed the Hellespont into Asia, with an army of veterans who fear his ambition more than any enemy. This is no longer Alexander the Prince, the survivor. This is Alexander the Invader, and he has come to fulfill a destiny generations in the making. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we witnessed the brutal forging of a king. Now we follow that king as he crosses the threshold from Europe into Asia, from Macedonian politics to world conquest. Today we march with him to his first epic confrontation with the Persian Empire at the Granicus River. We unravel the prophecy of the Gordian knot, and we stand on the precipice of the battle that will pit king against king, the legendary clash at Issus. The history books tell us Alexander invaded Persia to avenge the wars of a century and a half ago, but this was never just about revenge. This was a deeply personal odyssey. For every city he conquered, he was stepping further out of the shadow of his murdered father. For every army he defeated, he was silencing the whispers that he was a usurper. Our story resumes in the spring of 334 BC. Alexander stands on the shores of Asia Minor, having left his homeland in the hands of his father's most trusted general, Antipater. He has brought with him an army of 32,000 infantry and over 5,000 cavalry, but his treasury is nearly empty. He has no supply lines. His fleet is no match for the might of the Persian navy. He has gambled everything on a single desperate strategy: to win, and to win so decisively that the riches of the conquered land will fuel his war machine. This is a conqueror running on fumes and sheer terrifying self-belief. His first objective: find a Persian army and annihilate it. The Persian satraps, the regional governors of Asia Minor, were not idle. They gathered their forces to meet the young invader. Among them was a brilliant Greek mercenary commander named Memnon of Rhodes, who knew the Macedonians well. Memnon's advice was chillingly practical. Do not fight him, he urged. Burn the fields, destroy the harvests, and raze the cities. Starve his army and force him to retreat. But the Persian nobles, proud and unwilling to destroy their own lands, dismissed this scorched earth strategy. They believed their superior cavalry, positioned on the high, steep eastern bank of the Granicus River, would be enough to crush the Macedonian upstart. In May of 334 BC, Alexander's army arrived at the Granicus. His most experienced general, Parmenion, saw the trap and advised him to wait, to cross under the cover of darkness. An attack now, across a river and uphill against a fortified position, was suicide. Alexander, scoffing at the notion, declared, "I would be ashamed after having easily crossed the Hellespont if this little stream keeps us from crossing." He would not give the Persians the satisfaction of seeing him hesitate. He ordered the attack immediately. At the head of his elite companion cavalry, Alexander himself led the charge into the churning water and up the muddy bank, straight into a wall of Persian missile fire. The battle exploded into a chaotic, brutal melee. Alexander's gleaming armor and distinctive helmet made him an immediate target. He was swarmed. A Persian nobleman, Rosaces, struck him on the head with a scimitar, a blow so powerful it shattered his helmet. As Alexander fought back, another satrap, Spithridates, raised his sword from behind for the killing blow. In that split second, Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's commanders, lunged forward and severed Spithridates' arm, saving the king's life. With their leaders falling in the ferocious cavalry duel, the Persian line broke and the army collapsed into a rout. The victory at Granicus was absolute, but Alexander's actions in the aftermath sent a cold, deliberate message. The Persian nobles who had fallen were buried with full honors, but for the Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia, there was no such mercy. Alexander viewed them as traitors to the Hellenic cause. The survivors, numbering around 2,000, were not treated as prisoners of war. They were rounded up, bound in chains, and sent back to Macedon to work in the mines as slaves, a fate worse than a swift death. To complete the symbolic statement, he sent 300 suits of captured Persian armor to Athens to be displayed on the Acropolis with an inscription, "Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Spartans, from the barbarians who inhabit Asia." With the Persian field army shattered, the cities of Asia Minor began to fall like dominoes. Ephesus, Magnesia, and the great regional capital of Sardis opened their gates. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing the Greek cities of Ionia from a century of Persian rule. But he was also a pragmatist. His primary strategic goal was to neutralize the powerful Persian fleet. Unable to defeat it at sea, he chose to conquer its bases on land, systematically working his way down the coast. The victory at Granicus was not just a battle won, it was the first step in a grand strategy to dismantle the Persian Empire piece by piece. In the spring of 333 BC, after a winter campaign subduing the fierce tribes of southern Asia Minor, Alexander arrived at the city of Gordium in Phrygia. Here, he encountered a challenge not of flesh and blood, but of legend. In the city's citadel was an ancient chariot, its yoke tied to its pole with an intricate knot of cornel bark. The knot was so complex, its ends so cleverly hidden, that no one had ever been able to untie it. An ancient prophecy declared that whoever could undo the knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Alexander, surrounded by his generals and the expectant locals, wrestled with the knot, but it defied all attempts to find a beginning or an end. The crowd watched, waiting to see if this famed conqueror would be defeated by a simple tangle of rope. Frustrated, and with his characteristic impatience for problems that did not yield to direct force, Alexander declared, "It makes no difference how they are loosed." He drew his sword. In one swift, decisive motion, he sliced the knot in half. Whether he truly solved the puzzle or simply broke the rules is a matter of debate. But in that moment, the symbolism was overwhelming. Alexander was not a man to be bound by old rules or ancient problems. He would carve his own path to fulfilling the prophecy, creating his own solutions where none existed. He had not just untied the Gordian knot, he had claimed his destiny as the future master of Asia. While Alexander was securing Asia Minor, the Persian king, Darius III was not idle. He had taken personal command and was assembling a colossal grand army, drawn from the depths of his empire to crush the Macedonian invader once and for all. Alexander, hearing that Darius was gathering his forces near Babylon, began his march east. He pushed through Cappadocia and came to the formidable mountain pass known as the Cilician Gates, the main route into Syria. The pass was a narrow defile that could have been easily defended by a small force, but the local Persian satrap, misjudging the situation, had left it poorly guarded. Alexander's army secured the pass without a fight. Soon after, while resting his army in Cilicia, Alexander fell gravely ill with a fever, holding up his advance for a critical period. During this delay, Darius made a fateful decision. Believing Alexander was hesitant or afraid, and growing impatient with the logistical strain of holding his massive army, the Persian king decided to move. Instead of waiting for Alexander on the wide open plains of Mesopotamia, where his superior numbers would be a decisive advantage, Darius marched his army north, crossing the Amanus Mountains through a northern pass. The two armies, like ships in the night, had passed each other. Darius was now behind Alexander, astride his supply lines. The Persians captured the town of Issus, where Alexander had left his sick and wounded, and brutally tortured and executed the helpless Macedonian soldiers. When news reached Alexander, he knew he had been outmaneuvered. He had no choice but to turn his army around and confront the force that had cut him off. The stage for a second, decisive battle was set. In November of 333 BC, the two armies met. The battlefield was not one of Darius's choosing, but of fate's. It was a narrow coastal plain near Issus, squeezed between the mountains and the sea. This terrain was a strategic disaster for the Persians, as it completely neutralized their overwhelming numerical advantage. Darius could not deploy the full might of his army. At the center of the Persian line were his best infantry, 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and the legendary 10,000 Persian immortals. The great king himself was positioned in his magnificent war chariot in the center, as was the Persian tradition. His army was a sea of different peoples and languages, a testament to the vastness of his empire, but also a potential weakness. On the other side, Alexander's much smaller army was a hardened, unified force of veterans. He placed his trusted general Parmenion in command of the left flank, by the sea, with the difficult task of holding against the bulk of the Persian cavalry. Alexander himself took command of the right flank, at the foot of the mountains with his elite companion cavalry. Riding before his men, Alexander gave a rousing speech, reminding them they were heirs of heroes fighting for glory, not just for pay. He was not just a king, he was their comrade in arms. As he prepared to lead the charge, this was more than a battle for an empire. It was a personal duel between two men who embodied two different worlds. The battle began with Alexander leading a ferocious charge. At the head of his companion cavalry, he galloped across the Pinarus River and smashed into the Persian left wing. The disciplined Macedonian cavalry tore through the opposing infantry, creating chaos and panic. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, Parmenion's forces were under immense pressure, desperately holding their ground against the superior Persian cavalry. But the decisive action was in the center. Alexander, having shattered the Persian left, did not give chase. Instead, he wheeled his cavalry inwards, crashing into the flank of Darius's elite Greek mercenaries, who were locked in a brutal struggle with the Macedonian phalanx. This sudden, devastating charge from the flank broke the heart of the Persian army. Alexander now had a clear line to his ultimate prize, Darius himself. Spotting the great king in his towering chariot, Alexander and his bodyguards charged directly at him. The fighting around the chariot was desperate, but as the Macedonians closed in, Darius, fearing capture, was overcome by panic. He abandoned his chariot, leaped onto a horse and fled the battlefield. The sight of the king's flight was the final blow. The leaderless Persian army disintegrated, turning a battle into a complete rout. The narrow plain became a death trap as the pursuing Macedonians slaughtered thousands of fleeing, disorganized soldiers. Alexander chased Darius until nightfall, but could not catch him. He returned to the Persian camp to find it filled with unimaginable riches. But the greatest prize was not the gold or silver. In the royal tent, he found that Darius, in his panicked flight, had abandoned his entire family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera I, and his young daughters. Hearing the sounds of lamentation from the tent, Alexander sent a messenger to assure them that Darius lived, and that they would come to no harm. He entered the tent with only his closest companion, Hephaestion. According to legend, the queen mother, Sisygambis, mistook the taller, handsome Hephaestion for the king and knelt before him. When her error was pointed out, she was mortified, but Alexander simply replied, "You were not mistaken, mother. This man too is Alexander." He treated the royal women not as captives, but with the utmost respect and chivalry, promising to protect their honor and maintain their royal status. This act of clemency was as powerful a statement as his victory on the battlefield. It showed a different side of the conqueror, not just a ruthless warrior, but a man who understood the power of magnanimity. He had defeated the King of Kings in battle, and now he showed mercy to his family. The Battle of Issus was more than a victory. It was a paradigm shift. For the first time, a Persian great king had been defeated in person by a European army. Alexander now held not only the western territories of the Persian Empire, but also the king's own family. Darius would later offer Alexander half his kingdom and his daughter's hand in marriage in exchange for his family's return. But Alexander, having looked the king in the eyes and watched him flee, had no interest in half measures. His reply was simple. There could not be two suns in the sky. From the banks of the Granicus to the narrow plain of Issus, the boy who had crossed into Asia on a desperate gamble was now the undisputed master of Asia Minor. He had faced down satraps and kings, proven his tactical genius, and survived by the slimmest of margins. The path ahead led south to the ancient lands of Phoenicia and Egypt. But the spectre of Darius was not gone. The great king was retreating into the heart of his empire to raise yet another army, for one last epic confrontation that would decide the fate of the world. A conqueror stands before an island city, a fortress surrounded not by walls of stone but by the sea itself. His enemy is not an army in the field, but the very geography of the world. For months, he has been told his ambition is madness, his goal impossible. He has defeated a great king on the battlefield and captured his mother, wife and children, but the war is far from over. The Persian fleet still rules the waves, a great serpent with coils stretching across the entire Mediterranean, a constant threat that can strike him from behind, cutting off his link to home. To kill this serpent, he must take its dens one by one. But this den, the island city of Tyre, is the most formidable of all. To conquer an island, he decides to do what no commander in history has ever conceived. He will build a bridge to it, a solid road across the waves. This is a new kind of war, a contest not merely of courage, but of engineering, relentless will, and brute force against the unyielding power of the elements. For 7 long months, this king will wage war on the sea itself, proving to his men, to his enemies, and to himself that for Alexander of Macedon, nothing is unconquerable. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we saw king clash with king at the pivotal Battle of Issus. We watched as Darius III, the King of Kings, fled for his life in a humiliating rout, abandoning his royal family to the mercy of the victor. Now, with the heartland of Persia still far beyond his grasp, Alexander turns his attention to the crucial Mediterranean coast. His strategy is simple and utterly brilliant. The Persian navy, a constant and dangerous threat to his supply lines and his control of Greece, is not primarily Persian at all. It is manned and harbored by the great maritime peoples of Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt. If he cannot defeat their navy at sea, he will conquer its ports, leaving the fleet homeless, crewless, and with no choice but to turn its ships to his own cause. Today, we witness one of history's most incredible feats of military engineering, the grueling 7-month siege of Tyre. We will then march south with Alexander's hardened army to the stubborn gates of Gaza, a fortress that will test his patience and reveal a darker, more ruthless side of his character. And finally, we will journey with him into the mystical heart of Egypt, across a perilous desert, to consult an oracle that will change Alexander and his destiny forever. This is the story of how Alexander the tactician became Alexander the engineer, the liberator, and in the eyes of many, a living god. The king is on the move, and he will not be stopped by towering walls, by scorched deserts, or even by the sea itself. After his stunning victory at Issus, most Phoenician cities, including Byblos and Sidon, quickly saw which way the political winds were blowing. They opened their gates, their fleets defecting to join Alexander's cause. But Tyre was different. It was a proud ancient metropolis, built on an island about a kilometer from the coast, its magnificent walls rising a breathtaking 150 feet directly from the sea. The Tyrians, confident in their island fortress, sent gifts and offered a pact of neutrality. But when Alexander, citing his ancestral link to their god Melkart, whom he identified with his own ancestor Heracles, requested to enter the city to offer a sacrifice, they refused. For a king bent on total dominion, who saw himself on a divine mission, this was an intolerable insult. To make matters worse, sealing their own doom, the Tyrians captured some of Alexander's men, executed them on the walls in full view of the Macedonian army, and contemptuously threw their bodies into the sea. Frustrated and now utterly enraged, Alexander announced a plan so audacious his own engineers thought it impossible. He would build a massive land bridge, a mole, across the sea to the island. In January of 332 BC, the monumental work began. His entire army became a construction crew. Thousands of soldiers and local laborers demolished the old city on the mainland for stone and rubble, while timber was brought from the famed forests of Lebanon to drive piles into the seabed. The Tyrians mocked them from the safety of their warships, but as the mole grew, stretching 100, then 200 feet wide out into the channel, derision turned to desperation. They launched amphibious raids, their sailors swimming to the causeway to disrupt the work, while ships fired arrows and projectiles at the unprotected workers. Alexander countered by building two massive 150-foot siege towers at the end of the mole. These were covered in rawhide to protect against fire arrows and armed with powerful catapults to provide covering fire for his men. The Tyrians, masters of the sea, responded with a stroke of diabolical genius. They took an old horse transport ship and loaded its hold with dry branches, pitch, sulfur, and other combustibles. From its masts, they hung cauldrons filled with flammable oil. On a day with a strong wind blowing toward the Macedonians, they towed the ship toward the mole, set it ablaze, and ran it aground directly into the siege towers. The ship exploded in a spectacular inferno, consuming the wooden towers and siege engines. As the fire raged, Tyrian sailors swarmed the causeway from small boats, destroying what remained of Alexander's hard-won progress. Any other commander might have given up, his project in ruins. Alexander, his fury stoked to a white heat, simply ordered his men to build a new mole, even wider and more resilient than the first. But he now understood a critical truth. He could never take Tyre without a fleet of his own. Leaving his lieutenants to oversee the reconstruction, he traveled to the cities that had already surrendered and gathered a massive navy of over 200 ships from Sidon, Cyprus, and other allies, placing this new armada under his direct command. Returning to Tyre, he used his new fleet to blockade its two harbors, trapping the once dominant Tyrian navy inside. The siege entered its final, brutal phase. With his new ships, Alexander deployed battering rams mounted on reinforced vessels, assaulting the walls from all sides, while his land forces pushed his new siege towers down the now completed mole. After 7 long, grinding months, a breach was finally made in the southern wall. Alexander himself, never one to lead from the rear, led the charge over the walls into the city. The fury of an army held at bay for so long was unleashed in a terrible storm of violence. 8,000 Tyrians were slaughtered in the vicious street-to-street fighting. As a terrifying message to any other city that would dare defy him again, Alexander ordered 2,000 men of military age to be crucified along the coast. The remaining 30,000 survivors, men, women, and children, were rounded up and sold into slavery. Leaving the ruins of Tyre smoking behind him, Alexander marched his army south towards Egypt. Only one more major stronghold stood in his way, the heavily fortified city of Gaza. Its commander, a loyal Persian eunuch named Batis, had witnessed Tyre's fate, but refused to be intimidated. He believed his fortress, strategically situated on a high mound over 60 feet high and stocked for a long siege, could outlast the Macedonians. The walls of Gaza were too high, and its position too strong for the siege engines Alexander brought from Tyre. So, echoing his monumental work at the island city, he ordered his men to begin another massive engineering project, a huge earthen rampart around the entire fortress to bring his siege towers level with the walls. The work was grueling and dangerous. During a fierce sortie by the defenders, who burst from the city to attack the Macedonians, Alexander, leading from the front as always, was struck by a catapult bolt. The projectile pierced his shield and his armor, lodging itself deep in his shoulder and grievously wounding him. Infuriated by the stubborn resistance, the loss of his men and his own painful injury, Alexander's mood darkened considerably. Once the walls were finally breached after a 2-month siege, his mercy, so famously shown to Darius's family, was gone. The entire male population was killed and the women and children were sold into slavery. According to the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, Alexander reserved a special, horrific fate for the brave commander, Batis. Alexander admired courage, but he was enraged by Batis's defiant silence upon his capture. Allegedly, in a conscious and grim echo of his ancestor Achilles' treatment of Hector's body, Alexander had holes bored through the living commander's ankles, tied him to a chariot, and dragged him around the city walls until he was dead. With the entire eastern Mediterranean coast finally secured, Alexander marched into Egypt in late 332 BC. He was not met with spears and arrows, but with jubilant cheers. The Egyptians, who had suffered under often oppressive Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Showing profound political wisdom, he honored their gods, made sacrifices at their temples in Memphis, and most significantly, laid the groundwork for a new city on the Mediterranean coast. Alexandria, a city destined to become a global beacon of knowledge, culture, and trade. But Alexander had a more personal, more profound quest in mind. In early 331 BC, he undertook a perilous 300-mile journey deep into the western desert to visit the famed Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. After a grueling trek across scorching sands, marked by disorienting sandstorms, his army was miraculously saved when they ran out of water by a sudden rainstorm, and when lost, were reportedly guided by a pair of ravens. These omens only deepened his sense of purpose. What happened inside the temple's inner sanctum is known only to Alexander. But according to ancient writers, as he entered, the high priest greeted him not as a king, but as the son of Amun, the Egyptian king of the gods, whom the Greeks equated with their own Zeus. Some historians suggest this was a simple linguistic misunderstanding, with the priest meaning to say, "O Paidion," "O my son," but a slight mispronunciation made it "O Pai Dios," "O son of Zeus." The oracle reportedly confirmed that he was divine, that he was destined to rule the world, and that all of his father Philip's murderers had been brought to justice. Alexander left Siwa a profoundly changed man. Whether he truly believed he was a god, or simply understood the immense political power of such a claim to legitimize his rule in Egypt and beyond, is debated to this day. But from that moment on, he began to embrace his own divinity. He was no longer just the son of Philip. In his mind and in his propaganda, he was the son of Zeus Ammon. Meanwhile, Darius III, having retreated to Babylon after his humiliating defeat at Issus, had been frantically busy. He was not idle. He was raising a second, even larger grand army, drawing troops from every corner of his vast empire. He sent Alexander another offer of peace, this time far more generous and desperate. He offered all of his territory west of the Euphrates River, a staggering ransom of 10,000 talents for his captive family, and the hand of his daughter, Statera, in marriage. This would effectively make Alexander his heir and co-ruler of a divided empire. Alexander presented the astonishing offer to his council of generals. His most trusted commander, the veteran and ever cautious Parmenion, was stunned by the terms. He argued that it was everything they had fought for and more. "If I were Alexander," Parmenion declared, "I would accept it." Alexander's famous reply revealed the now boundless, almost cosmic nature of his ambition. "So would I," he retorted sharply, "if I were Parmenion." For him, the time for negotiation was long past. His goals had expanded beyond revenge or security. He sought total, absolute conquest. There was no room in the world for two great kings. He sent his reply to Darius, a message that left no doubt. There could not be two suns in the sky, he stated. He was not interested in being a son-in-law or a co-ruler of a lesser half. He demanded unconditional surrender, telling Darius to prepare himself and stand and fight for his kingdom, because he would be pursued to the ends of the earth. The time for diplomacy was over. The stage for the final act was set. In the summer of 331 BC, Alexander marched his army of roughly 47,000 hardened veterans out of Egypt, crossed the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and pushed deep into the heart of Mesopotamia. Darius, his generous peace offer scornfully rejected, had chosen the ground for the final confrontation himself. Near a small village called Gaugamela, on a wide, flat plain, he gathered a colossal army drawn from every corner of his empire: Bactrian and Scythian cavalry, Indian war elephants, elite Greek mercenaries, and the best infantry he could muster, with some ancient sources claiming numbers as high as 250,000 men. He had even ordered the ground to be leveled and cleared of obstacles to give his fearsome scythe chariots a clear, unobstructed run at the Macedonian phalanx. On the night before the battle, the Macedonians could see the horizon ablaze with the endless line of Persian campfires, a terrifying twinkling reminder of the overwhelming numbers they faced. Parmenion, unnerved by the enemy's sheer scale, approached Alexander and strongly suggested a surprise night attack to sow confusion and mitigate their numerical advantage. Alexander flatly refused. He would not steal a victory. He would defeat this grand army in the broad light of day for all the world to see, securing a glorious and undeniable triumph that would leave no question as to who was the true master of Asia. This would be the final reckoning. At stake was not a province or a coastline, but the fate of the entire Persian Empire and the mastery of the known world. One king had declared himself a god. The other commanded one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. As the sun rose on October 1st, 331 BC, only one would be left standing. If you are captivated by this unstoppable ambition, reinforce our battle lines by hitting the like button. Every like helps our channel conquer the algorithm and bring this epic story to more history enthusiasts. To witness the final cataclysmic showdown at Gaugamela, subscribe and sound the notification bell. Don't miss the battle that will decide the fate of an empire. On October 1st, 331 BC, two kings survey the same vast plain of Gaugamela, ready to fight for the world's largest empire. One is Darius III of Persia, who commands a colossal army drawn from every corner of his domain. Ancient sources claim his forces are a terrifying river of humanity, 250,000 strong, complete with fearsome scythed chariots and 15 war elephants. The other is Alexander of Macedon, whose hardened army of 47,000 veterans is vastly outnumbered but utterly loyal. Darius chose this ground, had it leveled, and is certain of his victory. Alexander, dismissing his general's pleas for a night attack, looks upon the impossible odds without a flicker of doubt, famously declaring he will not steal his victory. This is the endgame, a final decisive clash for supremacy. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we left Alexander having rejected Darius's final offer of peace, half an empire, and his daughter's hand in marriage. For Alexander, it was all or nothing. Now, at Gaugamela, the decisive moment has arrived. Darius, stung by his prior defeat at Issus, has staked everything on this single, epic battle. He has gathered one of the largest armies the ancient world has ever seen, drawn from the far reaches of Asia. He has even prepared a new weapon he believes will shatter the disciplined Macedonian infantry, 200 scythed chariots. But Alexander, a master of exploiting his enemy's weaknesses, arrives not with brute force, but with a brilliant and audacious strategy designed to turn Darius's greatest strength, his overwhelming numbers, into his fatal flaw. As the sun climbs higher over the plain, the breathtaking scale of Darius's grand army is revealed. In the center, following Persian tradition, the King of Kings stands resolute in his royal chariot. He is shielded by his most elite infantry, the 10,000 immortals and a solid core of Greek mercenaries. Hired soldiers he believes are the only ones who can truly match the Macedonian phalanx. On either side, vast wings of cavalry stretch for what seems like miles, a multi-ethnic tide of horsemen. There are heavily mailed saga, fierce Bactrians under their satrap Bessus, Scythians, Armenians, and even cavalry from India. Their objective is simple and seemingly inevitable: to envelop and crush the vastly smaller Macedonian force. Poised at the very front are his trump card, 200 scythed chariots, their long, sharpened blades gleaming, ready to mow down Alexander's infantry in a wave of blood and iron. Facing this terrifying spectacle, Alexander deploys his army with a cold, calculated genius. He knows he cannot match Darius's frontage. Instead of trying, he arranges his troops in a unique, staggered formation, angled sharply to the right in what is known as an echelon formation. He will command this right wing himself, at the head of his elite companion cavalry, almost inviting the Persian left flank to attack and overextend itself. The left wing, under the steady command of his most trusted and veteran general Parmenion, is given a daunting, almost suicidal task: to act as a pivot, holding back the immense Persian right flank against overwhelming odds. But Alexander's true genius lies in a crucial unconventional addition, a second line of infantry hidden behind his first. This tactical reserve has a single vital order: to pivot and form a new defensive front if, or more likely when, the Persians inevitably try to encircle his flanks. This flexible, two-layered formation is a trap. His entire plan is a high-stakes gamble. He will deliberately stretch and distort the Persian line, baiting their cavalry to charge further and further out, or while waiting with superhuman patience for that single, fleeting moment when a gap opens in the enemy center. The entire battle will hinge on perfect timing, unbreakable discipline, and Alexander's own iron nerve. The battle begins not with a head-on clash, but with an eerie, almost sideways advance. As Alexander leads his wing obliquely to the right, he threatens to move off the smooth, prepared ground that Darius's chariots need to be effective. Anxious, Darius hesitates no longer and orders his superweapon forward. The charge is a spectacle of pure terror. 200 chariots hurtle towards the Macedonian line, the sound of their wheels a rising thunder, their scythes promising a gruesome harvest. But Alexander is prepared. His men have drilled for this. On his command, the Macedonian infantry beat their pikes on their shields, creating a deafening roar that spooks many of the horses. Simultaneously, his light infantry, the agile Agrianians and javelin men, sprint forward as a screen, hurling a storm of javelins at the horses and drivers. Some chariots are stopped cold, but others thunder through the barrage. For these, the Macedonian phalanx executes a brilliant maneuver. The ranks of spearmen open up on command, creating channels for the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Once inside the trap, the horses are brought down and their crews, now isolated and surrounded, are swiftly cut down. In a matter of minutes, Darius's vaunted weapon is rendered useless and obsolete. Simultaneously, a massive and chaotic cavalry battle erupts on both wings. On Alexander's right, the elite Scythian and Bactrian horsemen clash fiercely with the Macedonians in a swirling, brutal melee. But the real crisis is unfolding on the left. Parmenian's wing is absorbing immense pressure from the numerically superior Persian cavalry led by the satrap Mazaeus. His men are buckling, stretched to their absolute limit. A dangerous gap is torn open in the Macedonian line. A contingent of Persian and Indian cavalry breaks through completely. But instead of turning to attack Parmenion from the rear, they ride straight for the Macedonian baggage camp, intent on looting and freeing the prisoners, which include Darius's own family. Parmenion is on the verge of collapse. He is in desperate trouble and sends an urgent messenger to Alexander, begging for aid. The battle hangs on a knife's edge. Despite the desperate message from his left flank, Alexander keeps his gaze fixed on the center. His deliberate, unorthodox advance has achieved its goal. In moving to counter his flanking maneuver, the Persian left-wing cavalry has been drawn further and further out. A fatal space has opened between them and Darius's central guard. It is the gap, the single fleeting opportunity he had gambled everything on. The moment has come. Alexander gives the signal. He wheels his elite companion cavalry, forming them into a giant, powerful wedge formation, a tactic designed to pierce an enemy line like a spearhead. He personally leads the thunderous charge directly at the opening. Their target is not just the gap in the line, their target is Darius himself. The disciplined Macedonian wedge, a spearhead of man and horse bristling with pikes, smashes through the weakened Persian screen with unstoppable, devastating force. The chaos is immediate and absolute. Alexander and his personal bodyguard fight with ferocious intensity, cutting their way through the panicked Persian royal guard. They get so close that a javelin, possibly thrown by Alexander himself, misses the king, but kills his charioteer, who slumps over the railing. Seeing the driver fall, panic ignites through the Persian ranks, as many believe the king himself is dead. For the second time in his life, faced with Alexander's terrifying personal charge, Darius III breaks. He turns his royal chariot and flees the battlefield, desperate to save his own life. The flight of the king is the death blow to the Persian army's morale. Seeing their divine leader abandon them, the center completely collapses. The retreat becomes a rout. With victory in his grasp, Alexander wants nothing more than to pursue Darius. But hearing the desperate pleas from Parmenian's endangered left wing, he makes the difficult choice to abandon the chase. He wheels his cavalry once more, this time to smash into the rear of the Persian right flank that is overwhelming his trusted general, securing a total and undisputed victory. The victory at Gaugamela is total and world-altering. Alexander is now the undisputed master of Asia. He marches south in triumph into the legendary city of Babylon. He is met not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The governor Macedonian, who had fought him so hard on the battlefield, surrenders the city. Priests and officials lay flowers on the road, burning incense on silver altars as Alexander enters, hailed as a savior who has freed them from Persian rule. He commands the temples destroyed by a previous Persian king to be rebuilt, showing respect for their gods. Next, he seizes the immense, almost mythical wealth of the Persian treasury in Susa, gold and silver beyond counting. But for Alexander, the war is not over. It cannot be over until Darius, alive or dead, is in his hands. While Alexander is being hailed as a king, Darius, the former great king, is now a hunted fugitive. He flees eastward with a dwindling and demoralized band of followers toward the remote and rugged satrapies of Bactria and Sogdia. His authority has crumbled. His own commanders, led by the ambitious satrap of Bactria, Bessus, a relative of Darius himself, look upon their king as a repeated failure, a man who has twice fled from the battlefield. They hatch a plot born of ambition and shame. Near modern-day Tehran, Bessus and his co-conspirators commit the ultimate act of treason. They arrest their own king, binding him in golden chains and throwing him in a humble ox cart, hoping to hand him over to Alexander to win favor. When news of this betrayal reaches Alexander, he is enraged. He launches one of the most relentless pursuits in history. Selecting only his toughest and fastest cavalry, he rides day and night, pushing his men and horses to the absolute brink of exhaustion. As Alexander's vanguard closes in, Bessus and the other conspirators panic. Rather than let Darius be captured alive, they stab him repeatedly, leaving him for dead in the wagon as they flee for their own lives into the eastern mountains. A weary Macedonian soldier, searching for water, stumbles upon the abandoned cart. Inside, lying in a pool of his own blood, is the last king of the Achaemenid Empire. By the time Alexander himself arrives, filled with a storm of emotions, Darius is either already dead or takes his last agonizing breath. Looking down at the body of his great rival, murdered not by his declared enemy but by his own treacherous subjects, Alexander is said to have been filled with profound rage and sadness. In a gesture of immense respect, he covers the body with his own cloak. The death of Darius in the summer of 330 BC marks the formal end of the mighty Persian Empire, a dynasty that had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries. In a sign of respect and brilliant political shrewdness, Alexander sends Darius's body to Persepolis for a full royal burial in the tombs of his ancestors. This act honors his fallen rival while strategically beginning to position himself not as a foreign destroyer, but as Darius's rightful heir. This moment is not just an ending. It is a profound transformation for Alexander and his mission. He no longer sees himself as a mere foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to Darius, the new king of Asia. The betrayal by Bessus fills him with a burning, righteous fury. In Alexander's eyes, Bessus had not just killed a rival, he had murdered a king, an act of sacrilege against the divine right of rule itself. Bessus, having the audacity to declare himself the new great king under the name Artaxerxes V, must be punished. Alexander, now acting as the rightful sovereign, vows to hunt down the usurper and mercilessly avenge Darius's death. The great war of revenge against Persia is over, but a new, far more brutal war is just beginning. It is a war to consolidate a vast new empire and to punish a traitor. The chase for Bessus will lead Alexander and his weary army even further east into the unknown and hostile lands of modern-day Afghanistan and Central Asia. A grueling campaign that will test their loyalty and endurance as never before. In the brutal winter of 330 BC, amidst the freezing, jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains, Alexander's seemingly invincible army is brought to a dead stop. For weeks, they have marched toward the heart of the Persian Empire. But now, in a narrow pass known as the Persian Gates, they are trapped. A terrifying cascade of boulders and arrows rains down from the cliffs above, turning the gorge into a killing field. Leading this desperate final stand is Ariobarzanes, the satrap of Persis, with a small but fanatically loyal force. For an entire month, every Macedonian attempt to break through is bloodily repulsed. Alexander, the master of the battlefield, has been outmaneuvered. For the first time since the difficult siege of Halicarnassus, his army is forced into a humiliating retreat, leaving their dead behind. The last gateway to the soul of Persia is barred, and for a fleeting moment, the fate of an empire forged by Cyrus the Great hangs precariously in the balance. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we watched as Darius III, the last great king of Persia, was brutally murdered by his own treacherous satrap, Bessus. This act of regicide enraged Alexander, who declared himself the avenger of the fallen king and vowed to hunt the usurper down. But before the great chase to the east could begin, Alexander had a more pressing goal: to secure the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid Empire, the magnificent city of Persepolis. Founded by Darius the Great, it was a symbol of Persian power, designed as a spectacular center for festivals and receptions. To get there, however, he first had to overcome the loyal Persian general Ariobarzanes, who had turned the mountain passes into a death trap. This is the story of Persia's last stand, a tale of incredible bravery, bitter betrayal, and the moment Alexander unleashed a firestorm of revenge that would reduce the jewel of the ancient world to ashes. Following his world-altering victory at Gaugamela, Alexander made a crucial strategic decision. He split his army. Recognizing the different challenges ahead, he entrusted his most experienced general, Parmenion, with command of the larger portion of the force, roughly half his troops. Parmenion's mission was to proceed along the royal road, the empire's main artery. This route was well maintained and relatively flat, making it safer for the heavy infantry and the vast baggage train, but it was also significantly longer. Alexander, meanwhile, was consumed by a sense of urgency. He chose to lead a smaller elite force of about 17,000 men on a direct and perilous path through the Zagros mountain range, straight into Persis, the Persian heartland. His haste was born of cold calculation. The treasury at Persepolis contained a fortune so vast it was almost mythical, the accumulated wealth of generations of Achaemenid kings. Alexander knew that if loyalists like Ariobarzanes had time to spirit that treasure away, it could be used to fund a protracted guerrilla war, raising new armies and challenging his control over the empire. He could not allow that to happen. After making short work of the local Uxians, who demanded a toll to pass through their lands, Alexander's confidence surged. In a rare and costly error, he pushed his vanguard forward without adequate scouting, marching his men directly into a masterfully prepared killing zone. Ariobarzanes, the fiercely loyal satrap of Persis, had chosen his ground with tactical perfection. The defile, later known as the Persian Gates, was in some places just a few meters wide, a narrow slot canyon flanked by towering sheer cliffs. This terrain was the ultimate equalizer. It completely negated the Macedonians' primary advantages. Their superior numbers were useless, as only a few men could advance at a time, and their legendary companion cavalry, so decisive on the open plains of Gaugamela, could not operate in the constricted space. From fortified positions built high on the cliffs, Ariobarzanes' men, estimated by modern historians to be a small elite force of 700 to 2,000 soldiers, unleashed hell. They rolled massive boulders down onto the path, crushing the front ranks of the phalanx, and rained down a relentless storm of arrows and javelins. The Macedonian vanguard was cut to ribbons, and a stunned Alexander was forced to order a chaotic and humiliating withdrawal, leaving his dead to the enemy. The bitter irony of the situation was not lost on anyone in the Macedonian camp. Just 150 years earlier, a small force of Greeks at Thermopylae had heroically held back the enormous invading army of the Persian king Xerxes. It was a foundational story for the Greeks, a tale of courage against overwhelming odds. Now, in a stunning reversal of history, a small Persian force was using the exact same strategy to defy them. The descendants of the heroes of Thermopylae were now playing the role of the frustrated, numerically superior invaders. Ariobarzanes' stand was more than just a defense of a mountain pass. It was a desperate, symbolic struggle. He was fighting to buy precious time for his shattered empire, but also to send a message to the world. Persia was not yet broken, and the Macedonians were not gods. For one long, bloody month, as winter tightened its grip, that message rang true. For nearly a month, the most formidable fighting force in the world was utterly paralyzed. Every attempt to force the Persian gates resulted in bloody failure. The path was choked with their own dead, and the rocks above were controlled by an enemy who seemed invulnerable. As the harsh mountain winter set in, morale within the Macedonian camp began to decay. The cold was relentless, supplies were strained, and the specter of their first major defeat began to haunt the minds of the soldiers. Alexander, the king who had never known failure, now faced a dire strategic crossroads. A continued frontal assault was nothing short of suicide, a meat grinder that would bleed his elite units dry for no gain. Yet, to retreat and take the long route around would be a catastrophic blow to his prestige. It would signal weakness, embolden his enemies across the vast, still unconquered empire, and give Ariobarzanes exactly what he wanted: more time. Just as the campaign teetered on the brink of disaster, a glimmer of hope emerged from the most unexpected of sources. Ancient accounts vary on the details, but Alexander learned of another way. Some sources say the information was tortured out of captured Persian soldiers. Others claim it was provided by local shepherds who knew the secret ways of the mountains, perhaps tempted by the promise of a vast reward. They spoke of a treacherous, barely visible track that wound its way up over the mountain ridge, a path considered impassable in the deep winter snow. It could, however, lead a determined force around the Persian defenses and allow them to descend upon the enemy's rear. Seizing this desperate chance, Alexander made a decision defined by his characteristic audacity. He devised a plan of brilliant deception. He left his trusted general, Craterus, in command of the main camp, giving him explicit orders to keep the campfires burning brightly through the night and to generate noise and activity. The goal was to convince the Persian lookouts that the entire Macedonian army remained in place, likely preparing for yet another doomed frontal assault. Under the cover of a freezing, moonless night, Alexander personally led a hand-picked force into the wilderness. This group consisted of his elite royal bodyguard, his fastest light infantry, and a small but vital cavalry contingent commanded by his close companion Ptolemy. They began a grueling and perilous forced march, plunging into deep snowdrifts and scrambling over treacherous, ice-sheathed rock. Every step was a risk, every gust of wind a potential discovery. It was an immense gamble, a desperate bid to turn the tables on the men who had so perfectly trapped them. As the first light of a frigid dawn broke over the icy peaks, Alexander's force, exhausted but resolute, gazed down upon the unsuspecting Persian camp below. They had done it. They were behind the enemy lines. With the element of total surprise on their side, they descended like wraiths from the mountain, falling upon the Persian rear guard. The attack was sudden, swift, and devastating. Simultaneously, the sound of a prearranged trumpet signal, blown by Alexander's party, echoed through the narrow gorge. Hearing it, Craterus launched his own full-throated, ferocious assault from the front, slamming his forces into the main Persian blockade. The Persian defenders were caught in a perfectly executed and inescapable trap. Attacked from both the front and the rear, their disciplined formation disintegrated into chaos. The tactical brilliance that had served them so well was now their undoing, as the narrow pass became a death trap with no room to maneuver or escape. Panic spread as the Macedonians exacted their bloody revenge. Many were cut down where they stood, caught completely off guard. Others, trying to scramble away from the slaughter, lost their footing on the icy cliffs and plunged to their deaths in the chasm below. The hunter had become the hunted. Even in this hopeless situation, Ariobarzanes and his most loyal followers, including his warrior sister Eutab, refused to surrender. Their defense had been heroic, and their end would be the same. In a final, desperate act of valor, They gathered their remaining strength and charged headlong into the closing jaws of the Macedonian phalanx. They fought with a breathtaking ferocity that stunned even the veteran Macedonians, a doomed charge born of pure loyalty and defiance. The ancient historian Arrian reports that Ariobarzanes and this small band of heroes managed against all odds to cut their way out of the encirclement. Their desperate goal was to race to Persepolis and organize a defense of the city itself. However, a darker story suggests their heroism was met with the ultimate betrayal. In this version, when Ariobarzanes and his men reached the walls of Persepolis, they found the gates barred. The city's treasurer, a man named Tiridates, had already decided to cast his lot with the conqueror. He refused them entry, abandoning Persia's last defenders to be surrounded and slaughtered by the pursuing Macedonians just outside the city they had died to protect. In a few brutal hours, the heroic resistance at the Persian gates was annihilated. The path to Persepolis was now wide open. In late January of 330 BC, Alexander the Great rode through the gates of Persepolis, the spectacular ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. This was not a city in the conventional sense, with bustling marketplaces and civilian quarters. It was a grand theatrical statement of power. Founded by Darius the Great, it was a wonder of Achaemenid architecture and artistry, a sprawling complex of magnificent palaces, reception halls, and monumental stairways. The Grand Apadana, or audience hall, could hold 10,000 people, its roof supported by 72 colossal columns. The nearby Hall of 100 Columns served as the imperial throne room. The very stones of the city were designed to awe and intimidate, with intricate reliefs showcasing the empire's immense power and the diversity of its peoples, bringing tribute to the great king. Occupied seasonally for grand festivals like Nowruz, the Persian New Year, it was the soul of the empire made manifest in stone. However, any sense of wonder Alexander might have felt was brutally extinguished by a horrific sight. Before entering the city proper, his army encountered a wretched group of some 800 Greek artisans. These men, craftsmen, sculptors, and laborers, had been captured over the years and forced to work for the Persian kings. To prevent their escape, they had been systematically mutilated, their hands, feet, noses, or ears cut off. This ghastly procession of crippled men, living symbols of Persian cruelty to Greeks, is said to have profoundly hardened Alexander's heart. His approach to Persepolis would be starkly different from his entry into Babylon or Susa, where he had cast himself as a benevolent liberator. Here his role was that of a punitive avenger. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, Alexander gathered his commanders and declared Persepolis the most hateful of the cities of Asia. He then gave an order that unleashed the pent-up frustration and greed of his army. The city was theirs to plunder, with only the central palace terrace itself to be spared. For days, the Macedonian soldiers descended into a frenzy of violence and looting. They stormed through the private residences of the Persian nobility, slaughtering any men who resisted, enslaving the women, and stripping every home of its treasures. The beautiful villas and gardens became scenes of chaos and destruction as a generation of accumulated wealth was violently seized. The greatest prize, however, was the imperial treasury which Alexander secured for himself. The sheer scale of the riches found there defied comprehension. The treasure was not in coins, but in vast quantities of uncoined gold and silver, known as talents. The ancient sources claim the hoard amounted to an incredible 120,000 talents. Transporting this colossal fortune was a logistical nightmare, requiring an estimated 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels to haul it all away. This single seizure of wealth was so immense it would fundamentally reshape the economy of the ancient world, funding Alexander's future campaigns, paying his soldiers, and pouring an unprecedented amount of capital into the Mediterranean world. 4 months after its capture, with the city stripped of its wealth, Alexander held a lavish victory banquet. As the wine flowed and the celebration grew wilder, an Athenian courtesan named Thais, the lover of his general Ptolemy, reportedly gave a speech. She declared it would be Alexander's finest act to burn the palace of Xerxes, the very king who had burned Athens to the ground 150 years earlier, and allow the women of the victory procession to take revenge for the desecration of Greece. Caught up in the drunken fervor, Alexander agreed. With a garland on his head and a torch in his hand, he led a procession of his companions and the courtesans to the great palace. According to Diodorus, Thais was the first after the king to hurl her blazing torch into the magnificent structure. The opulent cedarwood halls and grand palaces, which had stood as a symbol of Persian power, quickly caught fire. The entire palace complex was engulfed in a monumental funeral pyre, an act of destruction so profound that traces of the fire are still visible today. Ancient sources are divided on the motive. Was it a spontaneous act of drunken passion, as Diodorus and Plutarch suggest, or was it a calculated political statement to signal the absolute end of Persian power and avenge the Persian wars, as the historian Arrian argues? Either way, the architectural symbol of the Achaemenid dynasty was reduced to ruins. Alexander himself is said to have later regretted the act when he saw the ruins years later. The revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece was complete. Now Alexander could finally turn his full attention eastward to the grim task of hunting down a kingslayer. What happens when you hunt one monster, only to unleash another? After a relentless chase, Alexander the Great finally has Bessus, the man who murdered King Darius. But the very act of capturing him unleashes a far deadlier enemy, trapping Alexander's army in a brutal war they were never prepared to fight. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, we saw Alexander unleash his fury on Persepolis, burning the magnificent ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire to the ground as a final, terrible act of vengeance for the Persian wars. With the palace in ashes and its immense treasury secured, Alexander turned his focus eastward. His sworn objective was to hunt down and punish Bessus, the man who had murdered Darius III, and audaciously declared himself Artaxerxes V, the new king of kings. This great chase would lead Alexander and his weary army over the towering snow-covered peaks of the Hindu Kush and into the unknown, hostile territory of Bactria and Sogdiana, what is today modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. But the capture of Bessus would not be the end of the war. It would be the beginning of a new and far more vicious conflict. This is the story of Alexander's most grueling campaign, a desperate 3-year struggle against a new kind of enemy, a brilliant guerrilla commander, and the bloody war that almost broke the Macedonian army. With the ruins of Persepolis still smoldering behind him, Alexander initiated the epic pursuit of Bessus in the midsummer of 330 BC. What followed was a grueling testament to his relentless, almost superhuman drive. He forced his army onward at an unbelievable speed, covering immense distances through sun-scorched deserts and rugged, unforgiving mountains where water was scarce and morale was a precious commodity. Bessus, who had audaciously crowned himself Artaxerxes V, fled eastward, desperate to rally support in the far-flung satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana. To slow the Macedonian advance, he employed a scorched earth policy, methodically destroying crops, poisoning wells, and burning villages. Yet, he fatally underestimated the sheer force of Alexander's will. Conventional military wisdom dictated a pause for the winter. But Alexander was not a conventional commander. In a daring move that bordered on madness, he led his army across the formidable Hindu Kush mountains in the early spring of 329 BC, a time when the high passes were considered impassable. His men suffered terribly from deep snow, blinding blizzards, frostbite, and severe food shortages, but they emerged on the other side into Bactria. The gamble was a strategic masterstroke. Bessus was utterly stunned by Alexander's sudden appearance, which seemed to defy the very laws of nature. He panicked and fled north, seeking refuge across the formidable Oxus River, ordering his men to burn every available boat to prevent Alexander from following. His support among the local Bactrian nobility, already shaky, began to completely evaporate. They had little faith in a regicide who refused to stand and fight, a king on the run. Alexander, arriving at the riverbank and finding no boats and no timber in the desolate region, was undeterred. He ordered his men to perform a logistical miracle. They were to construct makeshift rafts from the leather tents they used for shelter, meticulously sewing the hides together and stuffing them with dry grass and reeds to create buoyant floats. In just 5 days, his entire army was transported across the nearly mile-wide river and into Sogdiana. The psychological impact was devastating. For the people of Central Asia, seeing that Alexander could not be stopped by deserts, mountains, or even the mighty Oxus, was to witness the arrival of a force beyond mortal reckoning. Bessus's remaining followers lost all heart. 2 of his own commanders, the Sogdian warlords Spitamenes and Datafernes, realized the chase was over. They arrested their self-proclaimed king in a small village and handed him over to Alexander's general Ptolemy. After a year of relentless pursuit, the great chase had finally come to an end. With Bessus finally in his custody, Alexander possessed the man he had pursued for over a year across thousands of miles. His objective was never simply to eliminate a rival, it was to stage a powerful and unforgettable piece of political theater, a lesson about the sacredness of kingship and the dire consequences of regicide. He was the avenger of Darius, the legitimate successor, and he would dispense justice in a way that both his Macedonian veterans and new Persian subjects would understand. Bessus was brought before him, stripped naked and bound in heavy wooden chains, a fallen king reduced to a spectacle of utter humiliation. Alexander, a man whose character swung between incredible magnanimity and shocking cruelty, first ordered him to be publicly flogged before the entire army. Then, in a gruesome act that deeply shocked his Greek and Macedonian officers, he ordered Bessus's nose and ears to be mercilessly cut off. This was no simple fit of rage, it was a cold, calculated political act. Mutilation was a traditional and deeply symbolic Persian punishment for rebels and traitors, the very punishment Darius the Great had inflicted upon a usurper 2 centuries earlier. By adopting this brutal custom, Alexander was performing for his new subjects. He was acting not as a foreign invader imposing alien laws, but as the legitimate Persian king of kings, upholding the ancient laws of the empire he now ruled. The final act of vengeance was even more horrific, designed to be seared into the memory of all who heard of it. After being publicly displayed in his mutilated state as a living warning, Bessus was taken to Ecbatana, the very place where he had committed his crime. There, while accounts of his death vary, the most widely reported version, described by historians like Plutarch and Arrian, is a masterpiece of symbolic horror. He was executed by being tied to 2 tall trees that had been forcibly bent down to the ground. When the ropes were cut, the trees sprang back to their natural position, tearing his body apart. This slow, agonizing death served as a terrifying and unambiguous warning to any satrap, nobleman or pretender who would dare to challenge the new undisputed king of Asia. With the Kingslayer so spectacularly destroyed, Alexander believed his conquest of the Persian Empire was, at last, truly complete. He was profoundly and dangerously wrong. Just as Alexander was founding a new city, Alexandria Eshate, or Alexandria the Farthest, on the banks of the Jaxartes River to serve as a fortress and a symbol marking the new northeastern boundary of his empire, catastrophic news arrived that threw his entire campaign into chaos. Spitamenes, the very same warlord who had so cunningly handed over Bessus, had ignited a massive, coordinated revolt that swept across Sogdiana and Bactria like a brush fire. The Macedonian garrisons left behind in cities like Maracanda, the wealthy capital of Sogdiana, were caught completely by surprise. The local population, feigning friendship, rose up and slaughtered them. Spitamenes proved to be a far more dangerous and intelligent opponent than Darius or Bessus had ever been. Allied with fierce, nomadic Scythian horsemen from the vast steppes, he flatly refused to engage in the pitched battles where the Macedonian phalanx was all but invincible. Instead, he waged a brilliant and ruthless guerrilla war, a style of fighting the Macedonians had never encountered and were utterly unprepared for. His mobile forces, composed almost entirely of expert mounted archers, would appear as if from the dust of the plains, strike with lightning speed at isolated columns, baggage trains or foraging parties, and then vanish back into the endless steppes before the heavily armed Macedonians could mount an effective response. This new form of warfare was a strategic and psychological nightmare for Alexander's army, which was built and trained for decisive, set-piece battles on open ground. The breaking point came in a disastrous encounter near the Polytimetus River. Spitamenes and his horsemen expertly lured a Macedonian force of over 2,000 soldiers, mostly inexperienced mercenaries, into a carefully prepared ambush. Using classic nomad tactics, they refused to close for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they swarmed around the Macedonian square, circling them relentlessly while showering them with a ceaseless storm of arrows from all sides. The panicked Macedonians, unable to charge an enemy that would not stand and fight, broke formation and fled in terror to what they thought was the safety of the river. There they were trapped against the banks and annihilated almost to a man. It was one of the single worst military defeats Alexander's forces ever suffered. Upon hearing the news, the king was reportedly devastated, refusing to eat or drink for days. For 2 long and bloody years, Alexander found himself bogged down in a brutal, frustrating war of attrition. He was forced to abandon his old methods and adapt, dividing his grand army into smaller, more mobile columns to hunt down an elusive enemy he could never truly pin down. With Spitamenes and his horsemen waging a fluid, untouchable guerrilla war in the countryside, many of the Sogdian rebels, along with their families and accumulated treasures, took refuge in a series of supposedly impregnable mountain fortresses. The most formidable of these was the legendary Sogdian Rock, a natural citadel perched atop dizzyingly sheer cliffs, accessible by a single, narrow and easily defended path. It was well stocked with food and water, prepared for a long siege. When Alexander arrived in the harsh early spring of 327 BC and demanded their surrender, the defenders, secure in their fortress, laughed at the Macedonian king below. They tauntingly shouted down that he would need soldiers with wings to conquer their fortress in the sky. Enraged by their insolence and driven by his refusal to accept any challenge, Alexander made a public offer, a massive reward of 12 talents to the first man who could reach the summit. He assembled 300 soldiers who had prior experience in rock climbing from previous sieges. Armed with nothing more than linen ropes and the iron tent pegs they hammered into the ice and rock, these men began to scale the sheerest, most exposed cliff face under the cover of a freezing, stormy night. The ascent was perilous. About 30 of them lost their footing in the dark and fell to their deaths. But by morning, the stunned Sogdian defenders awoke to the unbelievable sight of Macedonian soldiers standing on the peak directly above them. Believing that Alexander's entire force had somehow taken flight and scaled the rock, their morale shattered instantly. They surrendered without a fight, utterly defeated by Alexander's audacious psychological warfare. It was here, in the aftermath of this impossible victory, that Alexander encountered Roxana, the teenage daughter of a powerful Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, who had been among those seeking refuge. Ancient historians, such as Arrian, claim she was the most beautiful woman in all of Asia, second only to Darius's late wife. Alexander, who had until this point shown little interest in marriage, was immediately captivated by her beauty and fiery spirit. In a move that stunned his generals, he made a decision that was both deeply romantic and politically brilliant. He would marry her. This marriage was a masterstroke, a crucial step in his strategy to pacify the war-torn region. By marrying a local noblewoman, the daughter of a prominent Bactrian leader, Alexander was sending a powerful message. He was signaling his intent to merge the Greek and Eastern worlds, to rule not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate and integrated king. The act forged a powerful alliance with the Bactrian nobility, many of whom had supported the rebellion, and helped to finally bring the long, bloody and exhausting Sogdian War to an end. The stunning capture of the Sogdian Rock and Alexander's marriage to Roxana marked the definitive turning point in the war. The resistance, which had seemed so formidable, began to collapse as local nobles sought alliances with the new king. Spitamenes, the brilliant guerrilla leader, was finally cornered and defeated in late 328 BC by a large force under the command of Alexander's general, Conus. Spitamenes escaped the battle, but was soon betrayed by his remaining Scythian allies. Fearing Alexander's unstoppable wrath and seeing the rebellion as hopeless, they killed their leader and sent his head to the Macedonian king as a peace offering. After nearly 3 years of brutal fighting, the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana were finally, if uneasily, subdued. The campaign had been the longest, most costly and most vicious of Alexander's life. It had pushed his army to its absolute limit, forcing him to abandon traditional tactics and adopt a ruthless counterinsurgency against a relentless, invisible foe. He had prevailed through a brutal combination of terror, tactical adaptation, and ultimately political alliance. The conquest of this remote and hostile region secured the northeastern frontier of his empire and cemented his control over the former domains of Persia. With the last embers of resistance extinguished, Alexander could finally look to the next, and perhaps most ambitious stage of his journey, the legendary and mysterious lands of India. What happens when an unstoppable conqueror, fresh from victory, meets an army of living, breathing tanks? In 326 BC, having subdued the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great marches into the mysterious lands of India. But here, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, he would face his most terrifying challenge yet: King Porus and his phalanx of war elephants, a battle that would be his bloodiest and would forever change the spirit of his army. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. In our last episode, Alexander's brutal 3-year war in Bactria and Sogdiana finally ended with his marriage to the local princess Roxana. With the northeastern frontier of his empire secured, Alexander turned his gaze to his next great ambition: the legendary treasure-filled lands of India. In the spring of 327 BC, he led his veteran army across the formidable Hindu Kush mountains and into the unknown subcontinent. He believed he was simply claiming the final provinces of the Persian Empire, but he was stepping into a world with its own ancient rules of warfare. This campaign would push him to the absolute peak of his tactical genius, but would also bring him face to face with an enemy he could not defeat: the exhaustion and despair of his own men. This is the story of the Battle of the Hydaspes, the meeting of two great kings and the mutiny that finally broke Alexander's dream of conquering the world. Alexander began his Indian campaign in 327 BC, crossing into a land profoundly different from the centralized Persian Empire he had just conquered. He was now in a patchwork of vibrant, independent kingdoms and tribal republics, a complex political landscape that demanded a deft combination of overwhelming force and shrewd diplomacy. His first major strategic move was to secure a critical alliance with Ambi, the king of Taxila, a rich and powerful kingdom west of the Hydaspes River. Ambi, known to the Greeks as Omphis, saw Alexander's arrival not as a threat, but as a heaven-sent opportunity. He was locked in a bitter and long-standing rivalry with his neighbor, the mighty King Porus, and viewed the Macedonian army as the ultimate weapon to gain the upper hand. He welcomed Alexander with extravagant gifts of silver bullion, thousands of fattened oxen and sheep for the army's supplies, and, most importantly, pledged his own troops and resources for the invasion to come, firmly establishing Taxila as Alexander's forward base of operations. Across the river, however, a very different reception was brewing. Porus, the proud and formidable ruler of the Pauravas, reigned over the lands between the Hydaspes and Asisines rivers. Described as a man of immense physical stature and even greater personal resolve, he was not a king who bowed to foreign invaders. When Alexander's envoys arrived with the standard demand to pay tribute and submit to Macedonian authority, Porus's response was one of defiant pride. He refused outright, sending a clear message. He would meet Alexander not as a subject, but as a sovereign on the field of battle. He began to gather his army, preparing to defend his homeland. And so in May of 326 BC, the stage was set for a monumental clash on the banks of the Hydaspes River, known today as the Jhelum. When Alexander's army, numbering around 40,000 battle-hardened men, arrived at the northern bank, they were met with a terrifying sight. The monsoon season had transformed the river into a raging, mile-wide torrent of brown, churning water. A direct crossing against a prepared enemy would be suicidal. On the far bank, Porus waited with his force of over 30,000 soldiers, a fearsome array of chariots, and his ultimate weapon displayed for maximum psychological effect: a line of nearly 100 war elephants. The Macedonians had encountered these beasts in small numbers at Gaugamela, but this was a different scale entirely. The sight and smell of the elephants sent waves of panic through the Macedonian cavalry. The horses were terrified. Porus was confident, believing the impassable river and his living wall of tanks would keep the invaders trapped, perhaps long enough for the campaign season to end and force their retreat. Facing an impassable river and Porus's imposing army, Alexander unleashed the tactical brilliance that defined his legend. Direct assault was impossible, so he launched a sophisticated war of deception. For several weeks, he created a theater of activity designed to confuse and exhaust his opponent. Night after night, he marched his troops noisily up and down his side of the riverbank, making loud, conspicuous preparations and feigning crossing attempts at different locations. Ever watchful, Porus dutifully mirrored Alexander's every move on the opposite bank, shifting his forces to counter each feint. But as the false alarms continued without end, the Indian patrols grew weary. Alexander's charade lulled them into a false sense of security, and their vigilance inevitably began to dull. To reinforce the illusion, Alexander had large shipments of grain and supplies brought ostentatiously into his camp, creating the convincing impression that he was settling in for a long wait until the monsoon season subsided. Then, under the cover of a ferocious thunderstorm that conveniently masked the clamor of his army, Alexander executed his true plan. He left a substantial blocking force of about 1/3 of his army under the command of his trusted general, Granicus. Their orders were to maintain the main camp's noisy pretense and to cross only when Porus had moved his elephants to engage Alexander's main assault force elsewhere. Meanwhile, Alexander himself led a hand-picked strike force, composed of his elite companion cavalry and his most mobile infantry units, on a grueling 17-mile forced march upstream. They arrived at a concealed crossing point, a wooded cape shielded by an island that broke the river's raging current. Using makeshift rafts constructed from their leather tents, stuffed with hay and reassembled boats brought overland, his men began the perilous crossing in the pre-dawn darkness. By sunrise, against all odds, they had established a beachhead on Porus's side of the river. Porus was stunned by the news, initially believing it was merely another diversion. He dispatched a small force led by his own son, hoping to contain what he thought was a minor incursion, but the detachment rode straight into Alexander's elite, now assembled cavalry. The Macedonians crushed the smaller Indian force, and Porus's son was killed in the swift, brutal engagement. The Indian chariots, a fearsome weapon on dry plains, were rendered nearly useless by the rain-soaked, muddy riverbank. The main battle was now inevitable. As Porus advanced with the bulk of his army, he arranged his elephants in a formidable front line to terrify the Macedonian horses and smash their infantry. At that moment, seeing the elephants committed, Granicus began his own crossing downstream, perfectly executing the plan to trap the Indian king in a deadly pincer. Alexander led the cavalry charge himself, smashing into Porus's left flank, while the Macedonian phalanx advanced on the center. The Indian war elephants proved to be a terrifying and destructive force, crashing into the Macedonian infantry, grabbing soldiers with their trunks, tossing them into the air and trampling them underfoot. The disciplined Macedonian lines buckled under the sheer weight and fury of the assault. Yet Alexander's men adapted with incredible courage. Light infantry darted in between the behemoths, bravely targeting the elephants' drivers, the mahouts, with javelins. Archers aimed for the animals' eyes to cause maximum confusion. Groups of soldiers swarmed the beasts, hacking at their trunks and legs with axes and sharp kopis swords. Wounded, panicked, and without their handlers, many of the elephants went mad with pain and fear, turning back and stampeding through Porus's own infantry, creating immense chaos and carving bloody openings for the long pikes of the Macedonian phalanx to exploit. The battle degenerated into a gruesome slaughter. Even as his army disintegrated around him, King Porus fought with a courage that bordered on the superhuman. Described by historians as a giant of a man, he directed the battle from atop his personal war elephant, a towering beacon of defiance for his rapidly collapsing forces. Though wounded multiple times, historical accounts specifically note a severe wound to his shoulder, he refused to yield. With his formations shattered and his soldiers in full retreat, he continued to fight until he was one of the last commanders left on the field. Alexander, who had watched his adversary's incredible bravery with a growing sense of admiration, sent messengers from his new ally, Ambi, to request Porus's surrender. But Porus, full of contempt for his bitter rival, initially refused to even speak with him. Finally, weakened by blood loss and sheer exhaustion, Porus was persuaded to dismount and was taken into custody. When the wounded but unbowed king was brought before his conqueror, he stood tall, radiating dignity. Alexander, looking at the defeated ruler, asked him how he wished to be treated. In a moment that would become legendary, Porus gave his famous reply, "Treat me, O Alexander, as a king." Struck by Porus's regal spirit and unbreakable pride, Alexander did precisely that. In an astonishing act of political magnanimity, he not only restored Porus to his throne, but also expanded his territory, brilliantly turning a defiant enemy into a loyal and powerful vassal who would help secure the new eastern frontier of his empire. The victory, however, had come at a staggering price. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of the costliest and most harrowing engagements Alexander's army had ever fought. The victory felt different, earned against a foe who commanded immense respect. The battle also brought a deep personal loss for Alexander. His beloved horse Bucephalus, the companion who had carried him since he was a boy, died shortly after the battle. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Some claim it was from grievous battle wounds, while others state it was simply from old age and the exhaustion of the campaign, as the horse was now 30 years old, the same age as his master. Alexander's grief was profound. He honored his lifelong friend with a royal funeral and founded a city on the battle site, naming it Alexandria Bucephala in his memory. After the hard-won victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's legendary ambition remained as fierce as ever. His gaze was fixed further east, towards the great river Ganges, and beyond that, the very edge of the world. Intelligence reports and rumors of the vast and powerful Nanda Empire, which was said to command a colossal army on the Ganges, did not deter him. They only fueled his insatiable desire for more conquest. But his army, for the first time in its long and glorious history, had finally reached its breaking point. For 8 grueling years, they had marched thousands of miles, fought in countless battles, and endured every imaginable hardship, from the scorching deserts of Persia to the relentless monsoon rains of India. They were physically and mentally exhausted, their clothes and equipment rotting away in the constant damp, and they were profoundly homesick. More than anything, they were paralyzed by fear of what lay ahead. Greek sources circulating through the camp claimed the Nanda army was 5 times the size of their own, with a staggering force of 200,000 infantry, thousands of cavalry, and as many as 6,000 war elephants, a force that made King Porus's army seem small by comparison. When the Macedonians reached the Hephaestus River, the modern-day Bias, their will finally snapped. In an act of open revolt, the army refused to march a single step further. In a tense and emotional confrontation with his officers, Alexander delivered a powerful speech, reminding them of their shared glory, their divine mission, and the destiny that awaited them at the world's end. But this time, his words were not enough. His respected senior general, Conus, who had commanded with distinction at the Hydaspes, bravely stepped forward to become the voice of the soldiers. He spoke of their profound weariness, their desperate longing for home, the tattered state of their gear, the friends and brothers they had lost, and the simple human fact that they no longer had the will to continue. He respectfully but firmly urged Alexander to lead them back, to let them see their families again, and to refresh the army with new men from Macedonia. Furious and feeling utterly betrayed by the men who had followed him across the world, Alexander secluded himself in his tent for 3 agonizing days. He hoped their loyalty would overcome their despair and that they would relent. But the army waited in a profound, unmoving silence, their decision made. For the very first time, Alexander's indomitable will had been defeated, not by an enemy king, but by his own exhausted soldiers. He finally emerged and, to save face for both himself and his men, announced that the sacrificial omens for advancing were unfavorable. The conqueror of the world had finally been forced to turn back. The mutiny at the Hephaestus River in 326 BC marked the definitive end of Alexander's eastward expansion. He had conquered a king, but had been conquered by the collective will of his own soldiers. Though he had won his last great battle and expanded his empire to the edge of India, the dream of reaching the world's end was shattered. To commemorate the furthest point of his campaign, he ordered the construction of 12 massive altars, dedicated to the Olympian gods. With profound reluctance, Alexander agreed to begin the long journey home. His campaign in India was a masterpiece of military strategy and political acumen, but it revealed the physical and psychological limits of his ambition. The world was simply bigger than one man could conquer. But the journey back to Babylon would present a new and perhaps even deadlier set of challenges. What happens when the greatest conqueror in human history, who crushed empires, defied kings, and declared himself the son of a god, challenges not men, but nature itself? In 325 BC, standing at the edge of the known world, Alexander the Great made a decision that would forever stain his legend. Behind him lay the conquered Persian Empire, the treasures of Asia, and 10 years of victories that reshaped civilization. Before him stretched the Gedrosian Desert, a wasteland so brutal that no army had crossed it and survived. Cyrus the Great had failed. Queen Semiramis had escaped with only a handful of followers. Yet Alexander, driven by pride and the hunger for immortality, believed he could succeed where even the gods had faltered. The march that followed would not be remembered as a campaign of conquest, but as a crucible of endurance, a 60-day nightmare of death, thirst, and despair. It would not test his armies, it would test his soul. Welcome back to Immortal History, where the echoes of the past come alive. In our last episode, Alexander's march of conquest reached its limit on the banks of the Hyphasis River. His men, worn by years of war and endless miles from home, refused to go farther east. For the first time, the invincible king was forced to turn back, but Alexander's pride refused to yield. He would not simply retreat. The road home would become a new challenge, a final trial that would prove his supremacy not just over kings and armies, but over nature, fate, and death itself. This is the story of Alexander's final years, the march through the desert, the unraveling of his empire, the loss of his soul's twin, and the death that turned a man into a myth. The decision was made. The army would march home through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the deadliest places on earth. Alexander divided his forces into three. General Craterus took the wounded and older veterans along a safe inland route. Admiral Nearchus commanded a fleet along the Indian Ocean, charting untraveled waters. Alexander himself took the main army, tens of thousands of soldiers, families, and animals, straight into the heart of the desert. To most, it was madness. To Alexander, it was destiny. He sought to outshine Cyrus, Semiramis, and every hero who had failed before him. To conquer nature was to prove himself a god. At first, the march was orderly. The soldiers advanced in ranks, armor gleaming beneath the sun. But within days, order dissolved. The heat was unbearable, the ground scorched their feet, and water vanished from their supplies. The fleet that was supposed to resupply them never arrived, trapped by monsoon winds. What followed was a descent into hell. Men stumbled blindly through shimmering air. The desert swallowed horses and camels alike. When food ran out, men killed their animals for blood to drink. The sandstorm winds flayed skin from bone. Each day began with prayer and ended with death. When scouts brought Alexander a helmet of water, he lifted it to his lips, then poured it onto the sand. "If my men cannot drink," he said, "neither will I." That single act reignited their faith. For a moment, they forgot the pain. If their king endured it with them, they could endure it too. But nature showed no mercy. A flash flood swept through a dry ravine, drowning hundreds in their sleep. The sun burned the dead to ash. Mothers buried their children beneath the dunes. The strong dragged the weak until they too collapsed. When at last they reached the fertile lands of Carmania, less than half remained alive. Alexander had conquered the desert, but victory brought no joy. He had proven that he could defy death, but at the cost of thousands of lives. Pride had led him to triumph, but also to tragedy. From the burning sands to the edge of madness, Alexander's war against nature revealed the price of glory. If this tale of ambition and endurance captures you, conquer that like button and tell us, would you have followed Alexander into the desert or defied your king to survive? The survivors who stumbled out of the desert found an empire infected by corruption. While Alexander had been gone, his governors, the satraps, had transformed into tyrants. They extorted taxes, enslaved citizens, and raised private armies. The very empire Alexander had forged through blood was rotting from within. Among the worst offenders was Harpalus, Alexander's childhood friend and treasurer. While the king risked his life in India, Harpalus lived in Babylon like a god, surrounded by luxury and vice. He gambled away fortunes, kept hundreds of courtiers and companions, and bribed officials across the empire. When he heard Alexander was returning, he panicked. Stealing 5,000 talents of silver, he fled to Athens with a mercenary force, hoping to buy his safety and the favor of orators and politicians. His flight sent shockwaves across Greece. The great king's money was now financing anti-Macedonian factions. Harpalus was not alone. In the east, satraps had minted their own coinage. In the west, garrisons answered more to local commanders than to the crown. In Persis, the noble Orxenes insulted Alexander's Persian favorite Bagoas, and was later condemned and executed on charges of sacrilege and theft. In Susiana, Abulites and his son Oxathres were accused of hoarding silver and starving the army of grain. Alexander ordered them put to death. In Media, the general Cleander, accused of extortion and murder, was tried and executed, along with several officers. The message was brutal and unmistakable. The law was the king's will, and the king had returned. Alexander's rage was immediate and absolute. The desert had not broken him, but betrayal would. He ordered a purge that swept across his empire like wildfire. Corrupt satraps were arrested, their families punished, their wealth seized. Some were burned alive as examples. Others were crucified along the roads they once ruled. The machine of empire shuddered, then ground back into motion under the weight of fear. Yet there was method in his cruelty. The empire had grown too vast, too unstable. Local strongmen were calcifying into kings. Alexander shattered them before they could root. He toured provinces at speed, holding courts of inquiry, hearing petitions from the lowly and great alike. Temple treasuries were audited, grain stores inventoried, roads repaired. He ordered canals dredged in Babylonia, irrigation restored in Susiana, and depots rebuilt along the royal road. Where fear broke trust, administration filled the gap. Where administration lagged, fear returned like iron. Still, cracks widened. His Macedonian officers whispered that their king had changed. The man who once inspired loyalty now inspired dread. He drank more, slept less, and spoke often of omens and gods. Yet he also legislated like a founder. Tax remissions for drought-stricken districts, amnesties for certain Greek exiles to bolster friendly regimes, garrisons rotated to curb local loyalties, mixed units of Persians and Macedonians drilled together. The king's controversial experiment in fusion pushed from paper into practice. The strain between king and countryman came to a head at Opis on the Tigris, 324 BC. There, when Alexander announced the discharge of worn-out Macedonian veterans and the enrollment of 30,000 epigonoi, young Iranians trained in the Macedonian manner, the army erupted. They shouted that he preferred barbarians to his own. Some demanded to go home at once. Alexander leapt from the dais and thundered back. He reminded them who led them across the Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela, who paid their debts and gave them Asia. Then, in an act both theatrical and terrifying, he dismissed them all, inviting Persians to take their place. The camp froze. 3 days later, the Macedonians, humbled and afraid, came unarmed, begging forgiveness. Alexander relented. He sacrificed to the gods, embraced their leaders, and staged a vast reconciliation banquet where Macedonians and Persians dined together, 10,000 tables under the open sky. He proclaimed himself king of all, not of one people only, and took oaths from Greeks, Macedonians, and Persians alike. The crisis passed, but it revealed a fault line that could never fully be sealed. He needed a gesture grand enough to weld a continent. He would do so not through war, but through marriage. In 324 BC, Alexander reached Susa, the jewel of the Persian Empire, and turned statecraft into spectacle. Over 5 glittering days, he staged the Susa weddings, an imperial pageant meant to fuse East and West in blood. 80 of his generals and officers wed Persian noblewomen beneath canopies of silk and gold. Musicians filled the air with flutes and lyres. Incense drifted in clouds as priests of many nations gave their blessings. Alexander himself married two princesses, Statera Barsina, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III, binding himself to both branches of the Achaemenid line. His dearest companion, Hephaestion, married Statera's sister Drypetis, so that their children, Alexander said, would be cousins from both sides. It was more than ceremony, it was policy. He cancelled soldiers' debts, granted dowries to 10,000 common troops who took local wives, and enrolled mixed households onto royal stipend lists. Persian nobles received commands, Greek administrators were paired with Iranian counterparts, the court language widened, the dress at court blended styles. The ideal was sincere, even visionary, but it cut against the grain of Macedonian pride. Among the veterans, resentment festered. They saw their king in Median dress, accepting proskynesis, court obeisance, from Eastern dignitaries, and they whispered that Alexander loved Persians more than Macedonians. To them, the weddings looked like betrayal draped in gold. Yet the administrative logic was clear. An empire held by marriages and money was harder to revolt against than one held only by garrisons. Then fate toppled the pillar that steadied the king. During autumn festivities at Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill, likely a violent fever. For a week he seemed to mend. Impatient, he ate a heavy meal and drank chilled wine against medical orders. By morning he was dead. Alexander's grief was boundless and dangerous. He fasted and lay upon the corpse. He sheared his hair like Achilles for Patroclus. He ordered empire-wide mourning. Music silenced, horses' manes shorn, sacred fires quenched in some cities. He executed the attending physician Glacius and dismissed careless stewards. He sent envoys to Siwa to seek divine honors for Hephaestion and commanded that a monumental hero shrine, be raised. In Babylon, architects drew plans for a funerary pyre of staggering scale, tiered like a ziggurat, studded with golden statues, purple draperies, and cavalry friezes, a mountain of grief to burn a friend into legend. Grief transmuted into policy. Regiments formerly under Hephaestion were left without a new second in command. They would march under Hephaestion's name, as if the dead still led them. Cities were renamed, offerings were vowed at distant temples. Those closest to Alexander began to fear that sorrow had slipped into fatalism. The king spoke more of omens. He drank more, slept less, and pushed his body as if daring death to answer. Still, the engine of rule kept turning. He reviewed river works at Babylon, planned harbors in the Euphrates marshes, ordered shipyards to assemble new fleets, and commissioned exploratory surveys along the Arabian littoral. Even broken, he built. By early 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon, the navel of his empire. Omens multiplied, a crown blown from a statue into the river, a captive lion escaping its cage, priests warning that the city was ill-omened for him. The Chaldean astrologers urged him to avoid entry, or at least move his residence outside the walls. Alexander compromised. He diverted his ceremonial entry, sacrificed for purification, then proceeded anyway. Fate, if it existed, would find him anywhere. Babylon throbbed with plans. The palace courtyard swarmed with engineers, shipwrights, and surveyors. Alexander discussed a canal fleet to tie the Euphrates to the Persian Gulf. He reviewed designs for a harbor at Palakopus. He outlined a grand expedition to Arabia to circumnavigate its coasts, found cities, and seize incense routes. There were sketches for a monumental tumulus to rival the pyramids, and talk, perhaps only courtly gossip, of marching west one day against Carthage or Italy. The king, who could not sit still, was building futures faster than his scribes could record. Then came the feasts, funeral games for Hephaestion, receptions for embassies, victory banquets that bled into dawn. At a supper in the house of Medius of Larissa, Alexander drank deeply, laughing louder than he had in months. That night or the next, the fever struck. At first it was shrugged off. Babylon was a city of marshes and miasma. Fevers came and went, but this one climbed steadily. Day after day the heat in his body rose. The king sweated through linens and shivered in the warm air. He continued to issue orders from his bed, receiving generals and engineers, marking tablets with a seal that pressed less firmly with each hour. Theories mushroomed then and now. Malaria, typhoid, complications from an old wound, or poison slipped into wine by a rival. Another modern suggestion is Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare paralysis that could explain ancient claims that his mind stayed clear while his body failed, and that his corpse showed little corruption for days. The truth is lost between rumor and reverence. As word spread that the king was failing, a clamor rose outside the palace. The veterans, the men who had crossed a world behind him, demanded to see their Alexander. The doors were opened. In a hushed procession, they filed past the bed. He could no longer speak, but he raised his right hand to each, salute, blessing, farewell. On the final day, the generals asked the question that would set continents aflame. To whom did he bequeath the empire? The answer, preserved in competing traditions, was either a gesture, his signet ring given to Perdiccas, or a whisper, "To the strongest." Either way, the meaning was the same. He left them a world and a war. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. Priests said that his body did not show decay for 6 days, and crowds took it as proof that divinity had clung to him even in death. His last plans were read out in the days that followed. Fleets for Arabia, roads across Armenia, temples, cities, colonists, endowments, an atlas of possibilities. The council cancelled most as impossible or ruinous. The dreamer was gone. The accountants remained. The world trembled when the news spread. The King of Kings was dead. His generals, the Diadochi, rushed to claim what remained. Ptolemy took Egypt and, with quiet audacity, seized Alexander's body for Alexandria, making a relic of power. Seleucus fought his way to a vast Asian dominion. Antigonus and Demetrius battled for primacy in the Aegean. Cassander tightened his grip on Macedon, and with brutal resolve extinguished Alexander's dynasty. The unity Alexander had dreamed of shattered along the fault lines his life had barely fused, and yet his vision endured. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread through the lands he conquered. Cities bearing his name thrived as conduits of commerce and thought. Alexandria became a lighthouse of learning, its libraries and scholars bending the known world into new shapes. Trade routes stitched the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Coinage, language, and law formed an elastic web that outlived kings. In death, Alexander achieved what he could not in life, a kind of cultural immortality. His empire died, but his legacy became eternal. He remains the man who bridged worlds, who walked with gods, and who proved that greatness exacts a price paid in lives, in love, and at last in one's own breath. The death of a king is never the end. It is the echo that shapes the world. If the story of Alexander moved you, subscribe, ring the bell, and continue your journey with us through history's greatest lives and legacies.